Hello everyone and welcome back to JB's Little Gaming, where today we're doing a beginning of a new series on retro reviews. Basically the games that I have in my collection that I still have that I haven't reviewed yet. So why am I doing that? Well, basically at this point in my life I'm not in a position to buy new board games, but I don't want to give up on the board game content. I know I've been doing a lot of video game content, not a lot of board game content, so I want to get back to it. And I really thought about singing At This Point in My Life by Tracy Chapman, but I like and respect her too much to do that to her music, and I like and respect you guys too much to do that to you. In fact, true story, I was asked not to sing at a college gospel choir once. But anyways, let's talk about Star Trek Fleet Captains, and this is a real big box, and it's a real big game, and it's a real good game, I'll tell you that right up front. However, what I try to do very much on my channel is be as consumer friendly as possible, and point out both positives and negatives of games. Even if it's a game that I personally didn't like Harbor, you know, people like Giletti really liked it, and there are reasons for that, and I want to point that out. Or a game that I really do like, I also like to point out reasons that people may not like it. Like, for example, I recently did a review for Innis, and I really like that game, but it has its problems, and I try to be as fair as possible to help you make the best decision possible. So we're not going to get too much into like any rules explanation or things like that. I am going to show you aspects of the game to talk about things I like and don't like, but let's go ahead and get down to the table, or in this case bed, and talk about Fleet Captains. Alright, so first off, let's hope that Ember doesn't decide to get up and interrupt the game board as we go. She looks pretty comfy though, so we should be pretty safe. And just because I don't have the best setup, we're going to scroll through and then focus on things real quick. So there we have the glorious Klingon Empire, who were attacked when peaceably trying to make an alliance with the Federation. And then we have the game board here. Now this is the standard size for a game board. You can play up to more points and on bigger game boards, and you can play this 4 players as well. Here we have the different missions you may draw. We have the encounters that you may come across, and we'll take a quick look here too at the Dirty Federation, who not only did that, but used hyper-intelligent human beings and then put them into rockets in a different universe. But anyways, we'll look at all these things individually, but I did want to show off the overall components of the game, the overall setup. Alright, now for the demonstration game I set up here, we set with the basic setup where we have a total of 10 size and chips, and we're playing to a total of 10 points. You can play bigger or smaller games, and you can have games where, if you have big enough numbers, you even have more than 3 actions on a turn. So we go through the ship deck and draw cards, and we look at the size here. And ideally, we keep drawing cards until we get to that total. So here we have a total of 10 here. If we were to draw a card that's over the number we needed, we discard that and keep going. So another neat thing about this, well, and actually we'll get to this in just a second, but basically you do that, you have your mission deck. This is one thing I do really like about the game, is the mission cards you draw are either going to be scientific, influence, or combats, and then each card is going to show you, and it's also kind of showing you what that ship is potentially good at. Doing science experiments which oftentimes involve sensor readings, spreading out and getting influence in territories, which you can do as an action, or combat. So that's kind of a neat thing, and that's where we'll get our mission deck. And you can see here, after we get our mission deck, based on drawing the cards equal to those numbers for all of our ships, we put them down, and they'll be face up for opponent to see, unless, of course, they are a secret mission. So this one says to build a starbase, but we can keep that face down so our opponent doesn't know what that is. Now, after doing all that, then you're going to shuffle together some of these decks by your choice, because these aren't all individual cards. They are a deck, as you can see, the Wild Space deck, the Flagship Fleet deck. So it's kind of maybe a little bit difficult to decide what is going to be best for you to do, but basically you're going to go through and either pick a few decks that sound cool to you, or, you know, maybe try to focus more. Now, these cards are really nice because the way they're laid out is kind of neat. They show, like, for example, this card can be used in any of the 3 phases. It can, well, 3 different ways. It can be used during a combat. It can be used basically to, in this case, interrupt and be able to do something. But, you know, there's all different ways that these can be used in tests and things like that, or it can be a crew. Now, one nice thing about crew is that Basically, you can have one of each type of crew on a ship, and they're really nice because they give you a permanent effect. However, a lot of crew have a special ability where they can do maybe a more powerful effect than their base effect, and then you discard the crew as if they've put a great deal of effort into something. So this is kind of a neat system. The only way you draw more cards is every time you play one, you actually draw a replacement. So you encourage to play a lot of these cards. Now, at the same time, you can also discard one at the end of your turn, which you can also do with the mission deck down here. So there's a lot of setup involved. However, it's not too terrible, and I think once you get used to it after a game or two, it won't be too bad. Now, one thing that's either a potential positive or negative is the components. Overall, the components are pretty good. The card quality is decent and all of that. Some of the chits may be a little small, but they're functional. You know, it would be kind of cool to have a game that actually had like different plastic outposts or things like that you'd be able to put down, but that would definitely add to the expense of the game. Potentially the biggest issue is these things. They are not cardboard, they're, you know, just card stock, and as you play the game, well, you put these out, you're going to be flipping them over. They are a little bit, you know, thin. However, I've played this a decent amount and overall haven't really had any issues with it. And one thing that is nice is the ships. Now, they're just gray for the Federation or green for the Klingon, but they are different, distinct molds, which is one issue I had with both the expansions of the game. Like, for example, one of them is Dominion. Instead of having Jem'Hadar ships and having Cardassian ships and Breen ships and having all different kinds of stuff, they didn't really do much with the variety. But I do have to say that this game comes with all kinds of stuff, all kinds of ships that are, you know, decent sculpts. They are very distinguishable from one another. And if you have a ship you know very well, like being a DS9 fan, you know, yeah, this is Defiant. I didn't have to look at the name to know that. So overall, you might have an issue with some of the components, but I think the components are pretty decent. Now, what are some things I really like or dislike or are iffy about the game? Now, one of the things that I'll throw out there that you may either like or dislike or feel neither here nor there about is you can, as an action, scan a tile to look at a tile before you venture into it, and then you just put it back down with a token to show that it's scanned. Or you can just fly into a space. Now, movement is really interesting, so if I fly into this space, then I have to have 6 more movement to get out of it. That's basically how big this space is. And then I'm also going to roll a die. Now, in this case, I'm not likely to get it because I have to get a 1. There might be 1 through 3. There's all different types of encounters. But like in a lot of, like for example, the 4X game of Star Trek, one of the things that some people complained about is the randomness where some things may really help your opponent or hurt your opponent, whatever the case may be, help you, hurt you. And there's definitely some randomness in this game when it comes to that. So encounters can be just straight up bad things, like getting tribbles on your ship. That's something that you definitely don't want to do. Now, I do want to say this game has done a fantastic job of bringing a lot of Star Wars flavor into the game. Wormhole, they can be just straight up positive things. They can be things where you have to pass a test and maybe something good or something bad is going to happen, or even just something bad unless you pass a test to avoid it. But there is a lot of cool stuff in here. The thing is, though, you could have your opponent get 1 or 2 things that they just had to pass a relatively simple test, and they get a victory point. And you're only playing the 10 victory points, so that could be kind of a big deal. And then you run into something that damages your ship and forces you to go back home. And if those things seem to be happening, you know, particularly one-sided, then that can be an issue for some people. So overall, I like that system, but you may not. I really like the way the missions are designed. Like I said, you can discard one of these and draw a new one, and eventually if you run out, you can draw from the deck of your choice eventually. Now, I really like this system. I really like most of the cards are face up, so you can see what your opponent is doing, but there are those face down cards. I really like that your cards are kind of tailored to your fleet, and we'll go over and take a look at the Klingon fleet in a second here. Now, there's kind of a cool system where ships can combine actions. They can travel together, although they have to travel at the lowest ship speed, and they can do combat together or even do tests together, but it does count for an action for each ship. There's also a cool little thing that have the cloaking ability, which is another action you can do, and it's really neat. So you're cloaked and your opponent has to do a test to see basically beating your shields with their scanners in order to find you, but you can also take another cloaking action to put like an echo out there. So this one we see in the back actually is an echo. They all say cloak on the top, but if your opponent finds an echo, then basically it disappears. But you can move the echo independently from your ship that is cloaked and, mix them up on the tile when you first put them down initially, which is kind of a cool thing.
So while I talked about a potential few negatives, including maybe you may be annoyed by some of the tiles in that quality, you may be annoyed by the setup and learning the game. To tell you the truth, it isn't the best rulebook I've ever read. It's not the worst, but it's a little bit tricky. Overall, the thing I love most about the game, though, is the mechanisms. There's just another few nice little touches. For example, on these tiles down here, if let's say the Federation was one to explore this space, we'll put it so that they're able to easily read the text, and if the Klingons did, we'll put it this way. So again, you can tell who explored a space initially, because there may be some influence missions or things like that. So in the Klingon fleet here, we have the Klothos, the Chitaing, and the Mata. So in this case, we're going to just show off kind of how combat works, just real briefly. So it's another thing I really like. So every ship can move on their turn, and if they are on the edge of a space and they want to move into a space, they can go ahead and do that basically for one movement. Now, if there was no ship here and this was size 4 and their movement is, well, they're only actually at 1, which isn't great, but it was enough to get into this system. Now, at any point during your turn, except in the middle of a movement, you can change settings though. So this is a ship, and this is really nice on the cards how they're laid out. There are 4 different settings for the statistics of this ship. This ship has a cloaking device, so there are the settings for that. And if it's taken a damage, and you go into the yellow. Well, and if you take a second damage, you go into one of the red settings. So they would say they want to do a combat action. Now, before they do that, they can change to any of the other white sections that they want to. Now, this ship actually has pretty even across the board weapon statistics, so it's not going to make that big of a difference, but 7 is better than 6. And both sides would be able to roll, and the Defiant right now has a shield setting of 7. So right now we have a 7 attack against a 7 defense. So both sides would be able to roll a die. So if we roll for the attacker, they add 5. We roll for the defender, they add 5. But this can also be varied by playing one of those cards in order to boost whether it be attack or defense. But basically, if you meet or exceed, then you get through at the shields, and that's how you take damage. And let's say in this case we took damage, then we would have to tick the Defiant down so that we've set them to yellow down here. So the way that the HeroClix sort of mechanism from WizKids works here is really well done, and just all kinds of things about this game I think are well thought out. And while the rules may take a little while to get used to, I think they're pretty brilliant in the way this game plays. And if you enjoy Star Trek, you have the, lore and the things going on in the encounter cards. And overall, once you understand the systems of the game, the way you can play cards as crew, play cards during combat, you can play different effects at different times depending on how you want to use the card, use those heroic efforts. All of that's very well done. And even though there's a lot of decks, it's still well done the way that they're set up. And then you have the way that you have the face-up missions and face-down missions worth different points, where you may try to stop your opponent or let some things go. Do you want to engage in combat or not? You may have a very scientific-focused fleet that you want to stay out of combat the most that you can. You also get a victory point every time you destroy an enemy ship, so there's a bonus for combat. But if you have a scientific fleet and your enemy has a purely military fleet, you're going to play differently. So just the fact that this game plays out a little bit differently every time you play it. And while I don't recommend it at 4, it does play better at 4 than, say, War of the Rings or Star Wars Rebellion.
So do I recommend Star Trek Fleet Captains? Well, because I try to be as fair and balanced as I can, even about games I really like, again, if you're not interested in quite a bit of fiddliness and setup and some fairly complicated rules initially to learn, it's definitely not the most complicated game overall, but there's a steep level of entry, and if you're just looking for something simpler, then maybe I don't recommend it, or if you're not okay with a lot of randomness with those encounter cards, then, maybe it's not for you. However, if you like Star Trek, if you like the idea of variability in gameplay, some games may be almost tactical minis fighting each other. Some games may be running around doing science, but best figuring out how to make use of your limited number of actions and the type of ships that you've received, and you like the idea of really interesting mechanisms that play out well once you learn them, then I definitely highly recommend this game for you if those other things don't bother you. Even if you're not a fan of Star Trek, you may not enjoy the the lore and encounters as much, but there's still a lot to this game, and it plays very smoothly once you learn how to play it. And that race to the number of victory points that can be variable, that can vary the game length, then I think this game has a whole lot to offer. And that being said, there's only one thing left to be done. At this point in my life, I've done so many things wrong. I don't know if I can do right.